in France. We know the cycle in France. In the name of superior values, you have a community that is targeted over and over again with various...
The man you see on screen is Omar Suleiman, one of the most influential imams in the United States. He is one of the many Muslim leaders who have launched very harsh criticism against France in recent days.
And no place like France is this most crystallized in terms of policy in a way that creates a frightening blueprint that we all have to be very careful of.
Others, like Erdogan in Turkey, have gone so far as to propose a boycott of all French products. So why do so many Islamic leaders suddenly hate France? It all stems from what French President Emmanuel Macron calls the fight against Islamic separatism. By now, it seems clear that France has a problem with radical Islam, and Macron has made it clear that the problem is not Islam itself, but radicalism. But why are so many Islamic leaders feeling that they are being blamed for this? What is France's problem with radical Islam? In this video, we'll explain it all to you. On the 16th of October 2020, a teacher from a French middle school, Samuel Paty, was beheaded by one of his students. The murderer was an 18-year-old boy who'd been offended when his teacher showed some cartoons of Muhammad in a class for a debate on freedom of speech. To put this in perspective, since 2015, Islamic terrorists have killed 250 people. That includes the very creators of those Muhammad cartoons. Clearly, France has a problem with radical Islam. And no, this isn't just something that concerns only the extreme right. 89% of French people, of all ideologies, consider Islamic terrorism to be one of the most dreadful problems facing the country. But that doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists. Far from it. Nor does it mean that all those who are calling for boycotts against France are either. Without looking any further, the man who was at the beginning of this video has received death threats from the Daesh. As a comparison, other countries like Germany and the Netherlands also have large Muslim communities. But in the cases of France and Belgium, things are particularly serious. Take into account that we are not only talking about terrorist attacks here. Cities like Paris and Marseilles have entire neighbourhoods where only the police dare enter. In some cases, we could speak of a whole parallel state within French society. Radicalised communities with teachers who do not dare to speak freely in public schools, and women who cannot dress as they would like when they go out onto the street. The beheading of Samuel Paty was the last straw. As President Macron has said, enough is enough.
Macron launches crackdown on Islamist separatism in Muslim communities. Reuters.
This announcement has unleashed a wave of anti-French hatred throughout the Muslim world. The Gulf countries are organising boycotts against French products. The presidents of Turkey and Pakistan have asked their citizens to avoid buying French goods. Some religious leaders are comparing Macron to Hitler or to an Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. These comparisons make no sense at all. France has said that it wants to do away with radical Islam. That is, it's against Islamic terrorism, not against the entire Islamic religion. No one has talked about closing all the mosques or deporting all the Muslims or anything like we've heard from other countries. However, the real question here is, why does France have more problems with Islamic radicalism than other European countries like Germany? What does Macron propose to do about it? And why have so many Islamic leaders turned against him? Today, we will answer all these questions, but first, let's look at some history.
Pierre's son is called Ahmed.
The 1950s and 60s were France's golden age. And what happens when a country's economy soars? Suddenly, companies welcome immigrants with open arms. So, where did the French immigrants come from? From the French colonies of North Africa. Countries like Algeria and Tunisia sent millions of men to work in the factories of Renault or Tefal. We are talking about people who already spoke French as their mother tongue. They were called Pierre or Jean-Paul, and they married French women. In other words, they were fully integrated into French society. However, all of that changed in 1973.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon.
Exactly. 1973 was the year of the oil crisis, a crisis that hit France particularly hard. Unemployment rose, and all those companies that had received immigrants with open arms began to lay people off. From one day to the next, immigrants stopped coming to France. And that's when the French government brought out a new law. One which seems very reasonable, but one that had significant, very significant consequences. In 1976, France passed a law on family reunification. This law allowed newly nationalised French immigrants to bring their families from their countries of origin. This led to a new influx of immigrants. They also came from countries such as Algeria and Morocco, but they were no longer men of working age, but their families instead. Of course, this policy seems completely logical, and you're probably thinking, but what does all this have to do with Islamic radicalism? Well, it has an important influence. Think about it. Before 1978, the immigrants who arrived had no choice but to integrate into the country, to make friends, find a partner, and adopt a French life. However, from the 1970s onwards, these immigrants could already marry Algerian women who stayed at home and looked after the children. There were fewer and fewer mixed marriages, and the children of those immigrants, who themselves were called Pierre or Jean-Paul, were called Ahmed and Hassan. This in itself is obviously not a problem. People can be called whatever they want. After all, my name's Grant, and that sounds like a Scottish person choking on porridge. Grant. But this all does give us an indication of how these second-generation Algerians were beginning to have their own culture, different from the rest of French society. This explains why the first debates about the wearing of the hijab in public places did not take place in the 1960s, but in 1989. Because until that point, France still did not have a problem with Islamic radicalism. The problem begins, as so many of them do, in the late 1990s. So what happened then? From around that period, France began to lose competitiveness in the global market. We explained it here several years ago on VisualPolitik in a video that I'll link for you in the description. #BringBackSimon. Since 2000, France's net exports have not stopped falling. While Germany has become a global industrial powerhouse, France has been in economic decline throughout the 21st century. So, what's the outcome? Paris, which is the richest city in France, has a structural unemployment of 8%. Youth unemployment, though, has reached 19%. And guess which group is most affected by this unemployment? Exactly, the descendants of these Algerian immigrants. Pierre and Jean-Paul found work at Renault, but their children and grandchildren, Ahmed and Hassan, are unemployed. But the drama doesn't end there. Remember that we told you that France has strict regulations on all its markets? Well, this also affects the rental market. If any of you have lived in Paris, you know that it is almost impossible to find an apartment in that city. Even well-paid workers who arrive in the city hired by multinationals can end up in old, small, and tremendously expensive homes. According to expatistan.com, which, considering this video is a terrible name for a website, renting a 45-meter squared apartment in an average neighborhood in Paris costs around €1,200 per month. This is roughly the same price as in a city like Munich. The difference is that Paris has an unemployment rate of 8%, and Munich has an unemployment rate of 2%. If those expats who work in multinationals complain about housing, imagine our friends Ahmed and Hassan, who are unemployed.
Welcome to your new home in sensual, stylish, and stinking almost Paris. Just a stone's throw from the ultra-modern Stalingrad metro station, you can find your own squat at absolutely no cost. Wonderful parks with the best drug dealers in the city. Fun activities for the whole family. And the best Salafist mosques sponsored by our good friends from Saudi Arabia. Your tragic existence in these crumbling but affordable slums is waiting for you.
And what happens inside these neighbourhoods? Well, let's take a look at that right now.
The seduction of radicalism.
Many would think that radical Islam is a return to the Middle Ages, an ultra-conservative and ultra-religious ideology, right? Wrong. The ideology professed by most of the Islamic radicals in France is Salafism. Salafism was born in the 18th century in what is now Saudi Arabia, but it was in the 1960s that it became the dominant religious movement in that country. By that time, Saudi Arabia had already become the petromonarchy that we all know and love to do videos on today. Since then, revenue from dinosaur juice has financed the construction of mosques and Islamic schools around the world. This explains why Salafism is gaining ground over the other Islamic denominations. For example, do you remember the murdered teacher? Well, his murderer came not from the Middle East, but from Chechnya. Traditionally, the majority religion in Chechnya was Sufi Islam. However, in recent years, Salafism has been gaining ground. Something similar is happening in France. In 2004, there were already more than 5,000 Salafists in the country. These Salafists were mainly concentrated in poorer areas, and this explains news stories like this one.
Immigrant rioting flares in France for fifth night. New York Times.
Exactly. In 2005, France suffered from riots that lasted for 3 weeks. 2 civilians were killed and 8,000 cars set on fire. And that's when France realized it had a problem. And what do you think their solution was? Well, listen to this.
French Council of the Muslim Faith creates Theological Council to counter radical discourse. Euro-Islam Info.
Exactly. To stop the advance of radical Islam, France created a government body to communicate with the Muslim community. The idea was to promote a version of Islam compatible with democracy. Although some critics would say that instead what France was actually trying to do was to design its own version of Islam. And you might be wondering, so has this council worked? Well, decide for yourselves. In 2005, France had about 5,000 Salafists. In 2010, there were more than 12,000. And today, we're talking about 30,000 to 50,000 Salafists. That's not to mention all the terrorist attacks that have ravaged that country since then. And you will say, okay, alright Grant, so what's the solution? Well, the truth is that today there is very little knowledge about how to avoid radicalization. If there is one thing that is controversial in this world, it is an anti-terrorism policy. There are all kinds of solutions on the table. In Saudi Arabia, they have created de-radicalization centers that imitate methods of rehabilitating drug addicts. Terrorists do things like art therapy, group dynamics, and the like. According to the Saudi government, it is a success. But the reality is that there are already more than 50 cases of allegedly de-radicalized people who have committed attacks again. Some universities in Spain and California have even done brain scans of terrorists to understand what kind of messages could serve to de-radicalize a potential terrorist. The issue of radicalization and de-radicalization is so complex that it would need a video all of its own. So let's just move on to what Emmanuel Macron has proposed.
The crusade against Islamic separatism.
At this point, we can say that one of the main instruments of radicalism is radical mosques, and most of those mosques are paid for with money that comes from abroad. However, if you Google it, you'll be hard-pressed to find a concrete record of who has paid what. Because, unlike companies, religions don't need to publish their accounts anywhere. Like NGOs, religious organizations are exempt from paying taxes, so they are not investigated by tax inspectors. On top of this, another factor must be added. Salafism is not a hierarchical religion. Unlike, say, Catholicism, there is no Salafist pope or anything like him. Furthermore, when we say that Saudi Arabia has financed the construction of a mosque, we are not referring to the Saudi Arabian government. For once on this channel, we're not talking about the government. In most cases, we're talking about private groups. Think about it. It is enough for a group of Saudi millionaires to make a transfer to some volunteers in France so that a mosque can be built. The result? It is almost impossible to know where exactly radicalism is being promoted. And so, Macron's plan is to make a national registry of all Islamic places of worship, to know where the funding comes from and what kind of ideas the clergy promote. In addition, Macron also wants to ban homeschooling. In this way, it ensures that all French children receive the same education. And this is what has generated criticism from leaders like the President of Turkey.
Europe's Muslims being treated like Jews before World War II, says Erdogan. Euronews.
Yikes. If you have been a VisualPolitik subscriber for some time, you will know that Erdogan's great aspiration is to expand his share of influence throughout the Islamic world. This kind of statement is pretty much in line with that. I think it goes without saying that the comparison is completely absurd. But the truth is that Erdogan has not been the only leader to criticize Macron's plan. Listen to what the President of Pakistan has said.
Imran Khan asks Muslim countries to collectively confront trend of Islamophobia in European countries. First post.
Specifically, in the speech given by the President of Pakistan, the cartoons of Muhammad are described as hate speech. That is, according to this man, freedom of speech does not include blasphemy. To be fair, it is understandable that he should think like this. In Pakistan, they have not known what freedom of speech is for some time. As an example, this video could not be viewed from Pakistan because YouTube is banned throughout the country. Although, lucky for Pakistan, that means they don't have to see my teeth. The same is true for TikTok and all the adult pages that some of us enjoy. But hold on a minute, because I can already imagine what some people will think. This is a war between Western values and Islamic values. However, it is worth remembering that many Western leaders would agree with what much of the President of Pakistan has said. Pay attention to what Pope Francis said days after the Charlie Hebdo attacks.
Non si può provocare, non si può insultare la fede degli altri. Non si può prendere in giro la fede. Ma se il dottor Gasparri, grande amico, mi dice una parolaccia contro la mia mamma, ma gli aspetta un pugno.
Before we carry on, this is a pretty heavy episode. Let's all just take a moment to imagine the joy that is the Pope punching someone. Anyway, at this point, I think it's important to make one thing clear. Freedom of speech does include blasphemy, satire, and insults to a religion. There is the case of Slayer, Marilyn Manson, or Behemoth, artists who have made a whole career out of blasphemy. We've all seen films like The Life of Brian, or TV series that are driven by religious satire. All that is, or at least should be, perfectly covered under the umbrella of freedom of speech. No one should be afraid that they will be killed for criticising or satirising a religion or a political idea. This is particularly important to someone like me as a comedian. But wait a minute. Just because Erdogan and Imran Khan are wrong does not mean that Macron's plan is perfect. In fact, there are many legitimate criticisms that can be made of this recording of mosques that France wants to make. So now, we're going to open the debate to you guys. Do you think it is right for the state to regulate religions? Do you think that Macron's plan will solve the problem of Islamic separatism? And just how lucky are those people in Pakistan for not having to see this mouth? Leave your answer in the comments below. As always, we really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not my dulcet tones. Finally, this channel is sponsored by Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.